are the entertainment, but I just didn't want to have this event without sort of weighing in about this book, West Asia, that Mohammed has written. I mean, this book really does something special. It does reframe the whole picture of the Middle East. You know, the Saudi-Pakistan defense deal, IMEC, the India-Middle East corridor, Turkey's engagement with South Asia, China's role in the current conflict. These are all explained in the pages of this book in the framework of West Asia, and also of the Middle East future role in the rise of Asia, which is, I think, maybe the story of the 21st century in the world. And it offers also, in a very generous way, by the way, which I love to see in political science and strategy books, it offers a blueprint for US policymakers showing why we need to regard the Middle East as a resource and as a partner, and not as a junior partner, again, in the context of the rise of Asia. And so, as the president of the Middle East Institute, which has a mission of fostering greater partnership and cooperation and collaboration between the people of the United States and the people of the Middle East, this is really music to my ears. So I'm just very proud of this book. I'm very proud to have Mohammed on the team here at the Middle East Institute, and I'm very proud to present today's panel discussion with our Vice President of Policy and our Dean, Ken Pollack, and Mohammed Soliman. So thank you all again for coming, and welcome.
Thank you, Stu. As Stu said, I'm Ken Pollack. I am the Vice President for Policy here at the West Asia Institute. And it's wonderful to welcome all of you to this event. Mohammed, I know you've heard me say this, but I think many of you have heard me say this as well, that the highest compliment that I can pay a book at this point in my life is that it made me think. And boy, Mohammed, did this book ever make me think. It's a really interesting, really thought-provoking reframing of a whole variety of different issues. And as Stu just pointed out, you know, I'm just so impressed at how you tackled so many different issues and brought them together in a kind of a coherent scheme. And where I'd like you to start for everyone is, let's start with the obvious. Let's start with the name, right? Because this is where you start in the book, is to say, look, we need to stop thinking about this place with the name Middle East. We now need to start thinking about it with the name West Asia. So explain to the audience, if you would, the name, but even more important, the frame, right? Why is West Asia the way that we should be thinking about this part of the world?
I mean, thank you, Ken. Thank you, Stu. Thanks to everyone. I think West Asia, because I wanted to rebrand the Middle East Institute as the West Asia Institute. But in all seriousness, I think that book, that effort wouldn't have been here without so many friends and colleagues. My wife, Colleen, who's here, my colleague, Ali Tolba, and Ambassador John Negroponte. I think this book is absolutely a labor of love. And I really appreciate that the Middle East Institute gave me the place and the intellectual ecosystem to actually hone on those sort of ideas. Let me start with the case, what the case that the book is making. I'm making the case that the center of gravity that you have at the 21st century is Asia. 50% of the global economy, 60% of global growth, 50% of global demographics. So this is no longer me trying to theorizing about something that's just in theory or academia. Asia right now is shaping the global geopolitics. And the reason why it's West Asia, because we need to rethink about the Middle East as part of those sort of Asian dynamics, part of Asia as a system. And when we're thinking about Asia, we're always thinking about the question of China. And of course, this book is not trying to say that there's no China question, that China is not core to the rise of Asia, but also trying to say that there is an Asia beyond the question and shadow of China. There is Middle East, West Asia, there is South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and how those sub-regions are interconnected together, and how this region and the Gulf is core to that, is shaped by Asia and shaping Asia. How they are shaping Asia? They're shaping Asia because they have $6 trillion in Gulf Sovereign Wealth Fund that's writing all the checks for AI infrastructure, investments in Tokyo, in Indonesia, in India. Think about demographics. You have more than 9 million Indians in the Gulf. You have more than 4.5 million Pakistanis in the Gulf. And think about Gulf carriers. For you to fly from Europe to Asia, you have to go through Doha, Abu Dhabi, Dubai. Those are Asian carriers that are cohering that sort of system. And then also, why West Asia? Because I'm trying to tackle the question of, so what does it mean for American power? This is, at the end of the day, it's West Asia, but this is also a book on American grand strategy. What America is, how America should think about the Middle East from an Asia standpoint rather than a European standpoint. And I tried across the book to hone the idea of, this is a book that's not a reinterpretation of history. I'm not really trying to rediscover Edward Said for geopolitics. This is not a book within the anti-colonial tradition. This is a book about realpolitik. This is a book about grand strategy. I am trying to say that there's a different way of doing business for American foreign policy that's resource constrained, that's very much aware of some of those limitations that we have as a country on resources. This is a country that is very overstretched in Europe, in Ukraine, very overstretched, and of course in the Middle East, with all the wars that you have seen unfolding in the last 3 years, and also when it comes to the first island chain. So I'm not making the case in my book that this is the most important region. I am saying that this is the Asia First case for how to get Middle East policy right in a way that meet American needs when it comes to resources, local capital, and how should we think about the question of China and the Indo-Pacific. So this is basically the case of the book in less than a few minutes. There are different segments. I try to make sure that also the book does not leave any question unanswered. So what does it mean for Europe? What does it mean for North Africa? What does it mean for Turkey? So I tried in every chapter, I basically tried to give a complete story of how can we do this from a strategic standpoint. And I think the last section was the hardest section for me. And I know that this is usually hard for authors to admit. I basically relied on friends and colleagues who are serving in the US military, people who are serving in foreign governments to basically understand how can you make this operational? How can you make this operational when it comes to economic coalitions? How can you make this operational when it comes to military and security networks? I don't want to just leave a book out there and say that this is the problem and I just appreciate the problem and diagnose it without really coming up with a framework. And I think the main theme of the book when it comes to grand strategy was order building in the Middle East or West Asia and what this order building mean. And that required a lot of coffees, a lot of late nights, a lot of talking to friends and colleagues in Delhi, in Tokyo, flying to different locations because I was interested in a different security initiative that I feel that it fits in within that Middle East. So this is West Asia.
Perfect. So I'm so glad that you brought up order building, because to me that was one of many, but one of the most interesting concepts that you introduced was you made the point that you believe the United States needs to move away from nation building and think about order building, which, tell me if I've read this wrong, but, I saw as having at least two different meanings. One, it was about shifting from bilateral hub and spoke relationships to wider multilateral relationships and organizations. And also moving away from what we had been doing, which is trying to go country by country and bring them up, and instead creating more frameworks that would allow them on their own to grow, to aspire, to prosper without necessarily the US reaching up and pulling them up. Again, I thought a really interesting concept. I'd love it if you could explain a little bit more to the audience what you mean by that and what you have in mind in terms of what that would look like in practice.
Excellent question. In the book, I identify multiple problems when it comes to the region. One, and I would say the most pressing problem is, this is a region that's under-institutionalized. We don't have institutions. I don't pretend that the Arab League is functioning as such. And this has also started to become an anomaly in a globalized environment globally when you have the Organization for Latin American States, when you have ASEAN, when you have, of course, Europe is the premier example of what an integration and order building would look like. So this is the first problem. You don't really have institutions that can bring the region together around very basic things. We're speaking about, forget about tariffs. We're speaking about freedom of movement, security coordinations, maritime security, energy resiliency, all these basic aspects of order building does not really exist. So I'm trying to also diagnose that sort of problem and say how to do it. So how to do it is you have multiple examples that you can borrow from, or try to create your own hybrid version. You have the European example. I think that, and I'll argue that this is a very much European exceptionalism. This is a very particular to post-1945 moment in Europe, having the European Community and then later on EU. You have the currency integration and migration integration. This is very unique to Europe. But then I basically looked into the Indo-Pacific, and I think I benefited from being here in DC, studying in my grad school during the moment of Shinzo Abe, the rebranding of the Asia-Pacific into the Indo-Pacific. And over there, I would argue that America did what should we do in the Middle East. We did Quad. We did the Quad back in the day during the tsunami crisis.
Why don't you explain what the Quad is for those who may not be aware?
So the Quad is, at the beginning, it was a humanitarian initiative back in 2004 and in 2004 in a response to the tsunami of the shores of Indonesia. At the beginning, it was more of a dialogue, a coordination mechanism between 4 countries, the US, Japan, Australia, and India. And then afterwards, the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in 2007 flew to Delhi, and he gave a very famous speech called Confluence of the Two Seas, or in Arabic, Majma al-Bahrain. And he was talking about how we should rethink differently about the question of geography, because when we rethink about geography, we can maybe bring different players into the region. And on top of that, we should have institutions. So that was a Quad. And that was an American initiative. At some point, it was dormant between 2007, and then it was resurrected with former Secretary Pompeo under the first Trump administration. And it kind of became more of like a bipartisan arrangement that's embraced by Trump team and then Biden team, and now it's a completely different question. And then when we tried that sort of security framework, and we felt that there's some sort of Indian sensitivities about the Quad as a security vehicle, we pivoted. We basically went to Philippines, and now we have this Quad. We have the Philippines, Japan, US, and Australia acting and coordinating around security questions. So I am not really inventing anything new. I'm just saying, whatever we have done in the Indo-Pacific, I think that this is a playbook that can be used in the Middle East, because we have also different partners that we need. And I think when you're looking into the Iran war right now, I think my thesis is staying corrected. Iran war right now, you do have South Korean defense systems in Abu Dhabi. You have French fighter jets in the airspace of the Gulf states, and particularly the UAE. You have India taking a stand in a much more diplomatic way because of the economic interest. So calling it the Middle East doesn't capture the moment today, but on top of that, also calling it the Middle East doesn't give you the institutions that bring different players to the region. So this is basically order building. And final thing here, one of the challenges of writing the section on order building, that there's not really literature on order building. That was basically, I was trying to invent something, trying to see what happened in the Indo-Pacific, what the Indian, Japanese policymakers were thinking about their regions, and then basically that was super helpful to take their own prescription and try to apply this to the Middle East.
Okay, so I'm glad you raised the Iran war, because I promised everyone we're going to bring the Iran war into it. I would not let you leave here without hearing something about the Iran war. But for now, let's stick to the book. You mentioned Shinzo Abe.
Yeah.
I was not expecting a Shinzo Abe cameo in this book, but he pops up a couple of times. Explain why Abe is so important, and how you see Abe as having kind of maybe first conceptualized, this framing that you're proposing.
Yeah. I am an Asianist, not an Atlanticist when it comes to the way I think about geopolitics. I think I would give credit to a lot of intellectuals and foreign policy strategists from the East. I think I care a lot about some of those theories and ideas that came from the East, especially from Japan, from China, from Korea. So I pay a close attention to some of those theorists. On top of that, whenever I have opportunity to fly to Asia, I think I will absolutely do it at the expense of any sort of flights somewhere across the Atlantic. That's the priority, and I think understanding Asia is extremely, extremely important. Why Shinzo Abe? I mean, few things. One is, I think truly he is a transformative leader of Japan. I think he pushed Japan strategically forward in a certain way. And on top of that, it's very unique to find someone who rose to the rank of being a head of the state through democracy, who's also a strategist who understands questions of pounds of power, the future of his own nation in a generational sense. So seeing him picking up on the Quad and then basically trying to intellectualize this by going to Delhi and then digging into the literature to find the Conference of the Two Seas, Majma al-Bahrain manuscript that's already about the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea, not really about the Indo-Pacific and the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, to create that sort of intellectual framework around his conquest to redefine Asia-Pacific as Indo-Pacific is impressive. And then on top of that, it takes him the political instinct to basically come to Washington and basically try to make his own term of art, Indo-Pacific, the new operational reality for Washington grand strategy in Asia around the first and the second island chain. And for me, this cannot go unnoticed. I think if I would have been speaking Japanese, I think my first book would have been actually a biography of Abe, but that's maybe a project for a different year. And he was a great inspiration for the book. Like, why the redefinition of geography is important. Why this is not just a fight over vocabulary of terminology. Why those terminologies actually have a geopolitical meaning and have implications on state power, and also, and most importantly, how you think about the question of balance of power, which is core to the book thesis.
So I just want to follow up on that. And could you give I think it's a really powerful point, Mohammed. Could you give an example of how that rethinking, that reconceptualization, at least on Abe's part, although if you want to use someone else, that's fine as well, kind of then bore fruit operationally? Well, how did it change something?
So after I got married, I basically bought myself on a flight and went to Tokyo, and I do not regret it. I think Tokyo is absolutely a fantastic city, but maybe my wife was not happy about that. And I think sitting down with Japanese intellectuals and strategists and foreign policy makers in Tokyo, it was absolutely impressive to hear the thoughts about the way they are thinking about the operations in the Indo-Pacific, the way they were able to bring different partners to the Indo-Pacific around the Quad geographical scope. And it had a military meaning for them. It did have an implications for Japan. It had implications for the way the US-Japanese alliance operate as co-pilots in that area. So what this term co-pilot means is basically you are acting almost as a quasi force together. American forces and Japanese forces are together in Okinawa. So what does it mean for the question of West Asia? Should we rethink about the different players that should be part of that sort of order in West Asia based on what we have seen in the Pacific? Should we think differently about, and I think I identify France as that sort of partner because I think they're a willing country, they have the capacity, they have been willing to be out there in terms of deployment of forces. They're also not really part of truly Americanist, so they have a different cachet with the Greeks, with the Indians, with the Arabs. How should we think about the question of India? The rise of India, that will be a story that will be very important for the next 20 years. Maybe not the same impact as China in the past 30 years because China is very exceptional, but India do have an impact on Asia, on Middle East, and how should we think about as United States when it comes to West Asia? We all think about India as Indo-Pacific, but guess what? India is much more closer to what's happening in the Gulf and much more connected economically to the Gulf question than the Indo-Pacific theater, to the East Asia question.
So perfect, because that was the next thing that I wanted to talk to you about was India. You've got at least one chapter and really two that are all about India and its importance, South Asia and its importance, and seeing the connection between the Middle East and India as being part of this West Asia sweep. So again, help folks understand how you're conceiving of how they should be thinking about India and India's role in this part of the world.
So I'm not going to pretend I'm an India expert per se. I've traveled to India, but I'm not like someone who you would rely on to describe to you the actual details of domestic politics of India. This being said, you have a figure in Delhi, and of course there's a lot of questions around him, around Prime Minister Modi, but he's kind of resembles the great man of theory, idea for India. He is someone who is centralizing power, someone who's acting almost as the president of the country. He's rethinking about the country differently. He's trying to weave India into multiple security economic networks around Asia, around the Middle East. You see the Indian foreign policy makers everywhere in Europe, everywhere in Asia, Middle East. There's a different sort of energy around Indian engagement as a rising power. It doesn't mean today projecting power the same way America is doing, but there is a demographic question. You have this is the most populous nation on earth. This is a country next to Saudi Arabia are the two biggest economic growth in the G20. They are one of the biggest consumers of crude coming out of the Gulf. On top of that, you have the digital infrastructure, the trade, and how this is making India Gulf integrating into an economic space. Just to give people numbers, the trade between India and EU, and we had a trade agreement a few weeks ago, I would say last month. The India-EU trade is almost $180 billion, goods and services. The trade between India and the United Arab Emirates alone is $100 billion that will be doubled in 5 years. The trade between India and Saudi Arabia is $50 billion that will be doubled in 5 years. That means almost the trade between India and two Arab countries is almost the same trade between India and EU as a continent, as a group of nations, more than 27 nations. So it gives you an idea about the trade volume, and you add on top of that demographics, of course, with Indian workers in the Gulf. You add on top of that now, you have a security question, right? Will India will have to face the question of security? Will it be part of any security arrangement in the Middle East or not? You see now like Indian naval assets in the Red Sea, Indian naval assets doing maritime exercise in the East Med. So that's kind of like a new trend for India. So the question will be if this is sustainable, if this is just moody, is this going to be India will continue that trend after his tenure? Those are the questions that I'm leaving in the book quite open. I think it is India as it is. I think India will continue with that sort of trend, and so its own economic interests will always force it to play some sort of security role in the Middle East. So for the US policymakers, I think it's up to us to frame that sort of engagement. How can you actually integrate India into a framework that you design, that you actually able to also balance the different equities that exist? Because also, let me be frank here and very, very clear. After the United States and the Gulf, I don't particularly believe that you have another great power going into the Gulf. Seeing the performance of the Gulf militaries during this war, seeing the interception rate, seeing the idea that you have now Gulf militaries that are capable of defending their own territories, I think that will change the way they're engaging with external powers. So also I want to be cautious about the idea of, I am not really inviting India to play the security guarantor role in the Gulf. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that this role might not even exist after the US. I'm saying the idea of security links are going to be the new norms, and having different players there is very important. And how can we integrate and envision that sort of security framework?
So let's stick with India for a little bit.
Yeah.
IMEC, by the way, whoever came up with the acronym for IMEC doesn't know anything about acronyms. The India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, right? That should really be IMEC. I'm not going to blame you for that one, Mohammed. It's a terrible name.
Let's stick with IMEC.
IMEC is tailored for West Asia, right? It is, in some ways, it's West Asia, it's the concept of West Asia incarnate. Right? Help folks understand what IMEC is about and how you see IMEC as being kind of prototypical of what you have in mind.
Yeah, excellent question. And let me say that I think IMEC was helpful for my book because I was writing my book way before this became a thing. So IMEC gave the map and gave me a hook for the publisher and for people, right? Because what's West Asia? Like I'm making the case that the Mediterranean, the Gulf, and South Asia are all together as one system. So when you say this to people, sure, whatever. But when you have heads of states in Delhi At that time, it was President Biden announcing this India, Middle East, Europe corridor. Oh, okay. That's a thing, actually. This is a new redefinition of geography. There's real need. There's real strategic case to be made. I think, and again, I don't speak on behalf of the previous administration. I don't really know what was the grand strategic scheme behind IMEC, but I would guess that this was the first time that you have an American geoeconomic vision for Asia. We never had one, right? You can agree, disagree, assess the success or the partial success of Belt and Road Initiative. We can debate the results, we can debate the loans, we can debate all the things around Belt and Road Initiative. But this was a real Chinese vision for what Asia under Chinese economic hegemony would look like, right? That was a vision. America did not really have one. Part of it is its post-industrialized economy right now. Part of it is most of our engagement there has been very much around security and services rather than actual physical goods and infrastructure. Part of it is the way we're operating in the region has been very financialized. But anyway, we do not really have that sort of view about what's the economic system of Asia will look like. So, and also part of it, and this is very important, we had a polarized society around the question of trade and local economy in the United States for the past, I would say, since 2015, 2016, in the two parties. So also that's another aspect for it, right? It's very hard for us to imagine being part of an economic framework without thinking about the domestic politics of this. And you have seen, of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You have seen how the public turned against some of those trade agreements. So IMEC was a way of presenting American vision for Asia. Asia, I would say Asia minus China, if you would say. And so India, the Gulf, Europe. And also the moment is very important for us to take a moment and reflect on it. This was right after the Ukraine war. So there's a geostrategic case for Europe to think differently about its own political economy and its own strategic orientation after the decoupling from Russia. That was also a moment right before that was before October 7th and the conversations around Saudi Israel normalization. So what an integration in the region would look like. Three, it was also the increasing ties between India and the Gulf collectively. So at that time, that made sense that this India, Middle East, Europe corridor would be the go-to framework for regional integration or transcontinental integration. This being said, and I make the case very clear, I don't believe that those frameworks are a fixed reality. Those things are agile and change. So I'm not fixated on IMEC. I'm not fixated on any sort of framework or minilateral format. I'm literally saying, go try it. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, that's fine. This is the whole purpose of embracing minilateralism in this era. So IMEC doesn't work. It doesn't work. Then we should embrace different frameworks. If we're not able to get some of our foreign policy objectives, but you have a country called Saudi Arabia, I would say one of the most important countries in Asia at large for holy reasons, for economic reasons, for energy reasons, you need to integrate Saudi Arabia in a framework. That framework could be different, could be tailored different with different players if IMEC will not be operational for political reasons. And the same thing applies to every single minilateral I basically lay out or discuss in the book.
Okay, so I want to stick with this point about, because it's again another, for the back half of the book, you spend a lot of time talking about the new coalitions that you have in mind. And it gets to exactly this point that you just made, Mohammed, about the need for more fluid, more agile, more tailored kinds of relationships, coalitions out there. So lay that out a little bit. How should we be thinking about that? And in particular, contrast that with the kind of traditional alliances that the United States has, come to rely on, come to expect. How would this differ from that?
Yeah. It's very hard to basically try to argue against giants in foreign policy, but I will try. I think differently about alliances in the 21st century. I believe that the idea of NATO was very exceptional to 1945. I think it's very exceptional to 1945, an exception to European geography, political dynamics, the question of Germany, the German question, the French question, in addition to the Soviet threat. I don't believe that this security framework is the right framework for American engagement anywhere outside of Europe. Like, I don't believe that at all. I don't believe that NATO structure, Article 5-esque dynamic will be helpful for American security objectives in different regions. Part of it is they don't have the same history, it's different geographies. I mean, how are we going to do NATO in a maritime domain in the Indo-Pacific? It's absolutely difficult. How are we going to do this with West Asia, with all these different security aspects? So I always make the case, you can start with certain aspects of security rather than just a collective Article 5-esque security. So what I mean by that, air defense system, and I spend a lot of time on air defense system, and I stand corrected today during the war, that air defense system was the most basic and fundamental aspect of what a security coalition would look like. You don't need Article 5, you just need to identify a broader threat, and this is basically how you operate and think. But the idea of having a Kissingerian alliance structure, I think that this is not the right use of American bandwidth, political bandwidth, and on top of that, scale problem and ammunition problem that we have right now for the 21st century.
Okay, I want to push you on that. What would that look like in practice, right? Because again, we all know what a Kissingerian alliance system looks like. Give us a little bit more to chew on in terms of the new kind of alliance, the coalition that you're looking for.
Think Iran war, the current Iran war, and then I would say the Iran-Israel, there are too many Iran-Israel right now that I do forget. It's not last year, I think the year before. It gives you like a stress test for what those sort of security coordination mechanism would look like. And that was around air defense system, right? And we're speaking about countries who are not happy with the current government in Israel whatsoever. But when it comes to air defense system, there was much more coordination through CENTCOM around Iranian threat projection and projectiles across the Arabian Gulf. And you had so many countries from Jordan to the Gulf, of course, CENTCOM and Israel were working together around air defense system. But I'm not taking that forward and say that can be applied everywhere because you have different threat perceptions. And on top of that, you also have the political question of Palestinian self-determination. So I'm also trying to say, I don't have a one full answer, and that's the whole thing. You can work around certain issues that matter to majority of the players. Removing Iranian threat from the Strait of Hormuz, that's, I would say, right now is a top priority for everyone, regardless of the differences. So you can always identify certain threats and build coalition of the willing around it.
Okay, one last topic before we come to the war, and then before I turn it over to the audience, and that's AI. I think, again, a lot of people in this room know you for your phenomenal work on AI in the Gulf. By the way, we've got a terrific primer coming out on AI and AI in the Gulf from Mohammed very soon. We're very proud of it. It's an amazing piece of work. Again, I've read the book, so I know this. But for the audience, how does AI fit into this? How does the U.S. Gulf, potentially Asia, we did an event very recently on that, how does that all work together? Because I know, you very much conceive of it in that way. Help us to see the connections that you see.
I always call myself a boring engineer who speak very fast. And I started my career working at an AI lab, cat, not a cat. Literally, that was my job. It paid me well at the time. So let me talk about AI for just 1 minute and then go to the Gulf. I don't think about AI as models. I don't think that that's the right way to think about AI. I think about AI as infrastructure. Infrastructure means multiple things, means chips, data centers, and on top of that, of course, the question of energy. Right now, we have anywhere between 70 to 90 gigawatt compute globally, and depends on how you count it. For us to keep up with the current rate of compute demand that we need, for us to have personal intelligence, for us to have robotaxis in the streets of DC, we need anywhere between 220 to 300 gigawatt compute. That's massive. Let me add another factor that's extremely important to the question of compute. 1 gigawatt is anywhere between 30 to 50 billion dollars. And capital is not cheap. I mean, I'm not really throwing this number at you to tell you that this is easy. This is not easy. So building compute from energy standpoint, from chips, from capital and talent, that's a lot. And on top of the enterprise layer. So where the Gulf fits into that. Part of it is you have a trend for the past, I would say, arguably 20 years, whenever you have a new leader in the Gulf, that leader comes in with a plan, either Vision 2030 Saudi Arabia, or UE 2031, 2071, or Oman 2040. Any new leader that comes to the Gulf has a vision for a post-oil economy for the Gulf, for his own state, and of course, by extension, the Gulf collectively. And advanced technology, broadly defined, is core to that vision. And there is a reason, and I always make the case that Middle East policy is tech policy. There's a reason why every time we have new wave of technology, the first region when you have tension between American policymakers and that region is always the Gulf. So it was the 5G, but why 5G in the Gulf? Because that was the region that was making a big bet on 5G deployment at scale in Qatar because of the World Cup, in the UAE because of Dubai Expo, in Saudi Arabia because of transformation, and now the World Cup and Expo as well. So, and that also transferred into AI and compute. Part of it is this is their, like I said, their post-oil future. Second, they already have the strategic advantage collectively and individually for being, I would argue, the third strategic theater outside of China and the United States when it comes to compute as a service. They have the energy abundance, and energy doesn't mean that you have just crude, that you have the electricity grid that can give you 1, 2, 3 gigawatt of electricity to power those massive AI infrastructure. Second, there are a strategic capital with a long horizon when it comes to investment. So this compute will add to their ecosystem. So this is why it's a priority. And three, you have a younger generation of leaders who truly believe in AI. I mean, I want you to just go on Twitter and see whom Sheikh Tahnoun bin Zayed is meeting with. Sheikh Tahnoun bin Zayed, I think, is almost meeting with computer scientists on his Twitter feed. The same thing when it comes to, for example, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman when he was here. You will see him in the White House next to President Trump talking about the kingdom's compute need. You will see the Emiratis making AI front and center to the bilateral relationship with the different administrations in Washington. So it got elevated to the local level. And finally, they are underserving markets, right? Like, and those markets are, you have South Asia, East Africa, Europe. We're speaking about like 4 billion people within a good latency to the Gulf, around 100 millisecond latency. So when you have all of that, well, it makes perfect sense that the biggest bet for the Gulf will be compute. And in the book here, I'm basically making the case that the rise of the Gulf in AI is actually cohering this West Asian system. And I'm using commercial examples for that. For example, to give you ideas, the Emiratis are building the AI infrastructure for France and Italy, and Greece. Mistral AI, which is the French AI champion, they're building 1.4 gigawatt cluster in France. That's in partnership with the UAE. iGenius and G42 of the UAE are building super cluster, I believe like 0.5 gigawatts in Rome and another one in Milan. The same thing when it comes to the Prime Minister of Greece, Mr. Kallis, and the infrastructure they're building in partnership with the Emiratis. Let's go to India, the other side of West Asia. You have a lot of AI infrastructure in the Gulf that's being built just to service the Indian market. Funny story or funny fact, the largest Hindi LLM that's servicing Indian market is being run out of Abu Dhabi. So it gives you an idea that the rise of the Gulf when it comes to AI is not just a headline story. And the very idea that you have Iranian attack on data centers in the Gulf, I think confirms that thesis, that the Iranians perceive those sort of AI infrastructure as critical to the level that they're worthy of attacks, that they are embarked with factories, embarked with water facilities, energy facilities. So it gives you an idea also about how other countries are also perceiving these AI infrastructure in the Gulf.
Okay, so fantastic. And I promised the audience we would talk about the war. So let's talk about the war. And obviously I want to talk about it in the context of your book, of this concept of West Asia. And let's start there. Let's say that we had a fully developed American geostrategist who was thinking about this part of the world in terms of West Asia and exactly the way that you'd like to see them think about it. how would they think about this war in that context?
I'm usually trying to be very bipartisan on some issues. This is a book that was thinking about the Middle East through bands of power question. And this is a book that was no anti-war, but this is a grand strategy that's saying that there's going to be a cost coming with an operation that's implemented like this one. Doesn't have the buy-in from the American people. Clearly doesn't have a buy-in from our own allies and partners in the Gulf, clearly. And clearly the cost that being imposed on us are really high, not only us. This is an international conflict by the definition of closing the Hormuz Strait and the impact on the Gulf as a financial system and logistics hub. And on top of that, of course, aviation hubs. So this is a huge, huge cost that we're seeing right now. I think the whole purpose of the strategy was a balance of power. How can you build an order that at the end of the day, our own objective is to integrate Iran on favorable grounds to us, right? I mean, that's basically has always been the grand strategic scheme. Was this because you have a regime change in Iran? Is it because finally you have the democracy movement was capable of taking down the mullahs in Tehran? I mean, for whatever reasons, but at the end of the day, you're trying to build an order that's balancing them, containing them, making sure that they're much more contained, rather than basically going into that sort of discourse that's unfolding in front of our eyes right now. So that was my position. How we should think about Iran war. I mean, it's international conflict. There's a huge cost. I'm not really sure who is going to be winning in the battle of the world right now, because this is basically where we are. And on top of that, and I care about this question very well, I think people should pay attention to what's happening to American ammunition and the stockpile that we are using in the war right now. According to what's published, we use close to $7 billion of ammunition in the first few days of the war. And also on top of that, we're operating around 10 THAAD batteries globally. The very idea that we're removing a THAAD battery from Korea to CENTCOM area of operation, I don't think people understand how severe and what does it do to our own alliance structure in Asia if we think that the Asia and the Indo-Pacific is the most important theater and will be extremely important to American grand strategy. So I'm very, I would say, I'm not really sure how this will unfold, what was the end result, but I don't think it looks good for American power in the region, but also globally.
Okay, but that's going to be my last question to you, Mohammed, before I turn it over to the audience, which is how should we want the war to end to enable the kind of cooperation and growth that you're proposing is inherent in this West Asia model, right? How do we make the war come out in such a way that it facilitates that rather than retarding it?
I would ask John Negroponte this question.
Well, fortunately, we happen to have John Negroponte here.
At the end of the day, everything is politics by other means. At the end of the day, there's a need for some sort of a political understanding. I'm not saying an agreement. I'm not really saying a certain arrangement. But if the war is heading towards different scenarios, one, that you have a regime that's well entrenched in Tehran, but economically damaged, of course, there's always a case to be made for a ceasefire that would limit the cost and the damage. Because I think right now, what worries me, what keeps me up at night is what's happening to our Gulf alliance and how they're thinking about America right now. Mm-hmm. And I don't think people understand the psychological impact of this war of choice on our own allies and partners who basically believe that America is always a force of stabilization in that part of the world. But now we have Iraq war, now we have Iran war. Then, okay, so maybe we should revisit that. I think the longer this war continues with this level of cost, I think you're going to have a lot of voices to start rethinking about what actually is the cost of having that sort of partnership with the United States.
Very good. That's terrific. I think you've given everybody both a nice overview of the book, but also a lot to chew on. So let's open it up to questions. And yep, we'll start over here. That was the first hand that I saw go up, bring in everybody over the course of time. Ma'am, please.
Hi, Daniela Chancellor, Politico. Thanks for answering my call. What is your view on how security arrangements are going to be changing long-term in the Gulf with the United States? And I wondered if you're hearing live conversations right now between both countries and the U.S. about changing long-term security arrangements.
I mean, I don't speak on behalf of, first of all, great to see you in person after all these text messages. I think I don't speak on behalf of any foreign government whatsoever. I'm just giving you my gut feeling. I think there is a lot of disappointment about how this unfolded. And clearly that will be factored into any sort of understanding of the security partnership with the United States will go moving forward from now.
So I was half hour late, so sorry. Yeah, sorry. I was a half hour late, so if you covered my question already in the intro, I apologize. I'm completely sold on your argument, except the West Asia part, only because, only because the Siberian plain and the Caucasus don't fit into your argument, right?
Yeah.
I got a PhD from a department of Southwest Asia and Islamic civilization that was, and I think Southwest Asia has as much currency as West Asia, and I absolutely love what you're doing, because the Indo-Pacific framing is not the right framing for your argument. The Indo-Islamic and Indo-Abrahamic
And Indo-Islamic
frames are amazing. So I love everything you're doing here with this argument. And that whole U.S.-Indian rapprochement is a huge part of our future, and going through the Middle East / Southwest Asia / West Asia, for this new set of not alliances but relationships is just brilliant, and I love what you're doing. I think my question is, I'm not so sure that middle part, the Pakistan part, I haven't read the book yet, so I'm flipping through it, framing my question, and the other countries in between have fully, developed in your thinking, and all this connecting countries. So address my West Asian challenge, and then help me with the connectivity part between the Middle East and India.
Excellent question. So let me try to flesh this out a bit. A system doesn't exist only based on cooperation. Actually, this is not true. A system exists based on cooperation and competition. So why I'm saying that South Asia and Middle East and Mediterranean are converging is not only because there's good story to be told about India and Dairy. Actually, this is not true. This is why I have other chapters. I am arguing that how can you explain India's engagement with Greece, Cyprus, and Israel in the Mediterranean? How can you explain Turkey's increasing engagement with Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the Maldives? How can you explain both? I think they're both are feeding into each other, right? Both are creating that sort of integration for that sort of system by the virtue that those are the new coalitions. I don't believe in alliance structure, but I believe that those are coalitions that are growing. So this is on the India-Turkey part, and both those two countries, I would argue, are cohering that system actively because of their own engagement, because they're very active as a foreign policy player, as a military player, as an economic player. To your question around Central Asia, which I agree with you, this is not an area that I know well. To be frank, I think I'm trying to address that question through the Turkey-Azerbaijan relationship, and that's in the book. And I argue that Azerbaijan explains a lot of those sort of convergences, but also in the same time also explains why this is not 100% alliances, right? Because how can you explain the excellent relationship between Azerbaijan, Turkey, Pakistan, but at the same time Azerbaijan has a very strong relationship with Israel? So this is why I'm saying you should not think about them as alliances. Those are going to be conversion. You're going to have players who can be odd. Some players can switch between different coalitions, because none of those things are static.
Can I add one more sentence of endorsement? Just quickly, you also solved one other problem, which is the whole pivot to Asia issue, which you addressed in the book. I was flipping through to figure out how you did it, and people who deal with the Middle East always had trouble with the pivot to Asia notion, and you kind of solved it, because it isn't a pivot to Asia; it's a pivot in Asia, and a reconnecting.
Actually, let me add to that. I'm trying to solve it from resource standpoint. So I don't want to just reframe. I don't want to reframe the wording, reframe the positioning and say the Middle East is Asia, therefore we did the pivot. Actually, that's the opposite. I am trying to say, do order building because we need to pivot resources because we have very limited resources. Ammunition, stockpiles, THAAD, personnel. I want to take all these sort of assets and move it and actually ask a lot of those willing partners who have the economics, have the means to be responsible for their own security. So I am trying to solve the Asia pivot, but not really through rebranding. I'm actually trying to spend a lot of time, a lot of intellectual work on the very idea of how to move those assets and stabilize the region at the same time. Thank you.
Right here?
Lucas Howard. My name is Lucas Howard. I'm a grad from University of Maryland, and I'm curious, basically, why now? And specifically, why do you have this geographic reorientation at a time when there's new technologies that are kind of collapsing the world? You talk about AI. What is the link? Can you draw that link between technology and geographical reorientation?
Excellent question. I'm saying this as an engineer. I don't believe that technology will help you with the scale. Everything is you should think about geopolitics, security, and military through the question of a scale and how can you produce anything at scale. And one of the core themes of the book is America's scale problem. America cannot produce anything at scale at all. And because of that, you are seeing this ammunition problem crisis in Ukraine, and now you are seeing this life in Iran. And I'm arguing in the book that I'm very aware of that. Like, I'm not trying to add more burden to the United States. I'm actually trying to elevate the burden and by building those sort of security coalitions. The very idea you have South Korean defense providers who are giving air defense systems to the Gulf, that should be embraced as a model, because that does not take from your own industrial base. And at the same time, it's Korea, right? Like, it's part within the U.S. Security structure. And I'm trying to use that example and bringing more countries to give what those other countries need within an American security umbrella without having to sacrifice those, I would say, precious stockpile ammunition in the region. And on the question of AI, I mean, we can have great AI, great models, but at the end of the day, if you're not able to produce actual tanks, actual submarines, it doesn't matter.
Hi, I'm a student of Masters at Johns Hopkins. My question was on the
Your name?
Umar. My question was on the aspect of data centers. You mentioned that the critical infrastructure is going to be the most important, especially on the aspect of AI. How do you think the physical security frameworks of critical infrastructure is going to come about in a state of conflict on data centers, especially?
Yeah, I think it's. I think Daniela would literally tell you that this is our entire conversation right now, and I think I've talked to 20 reporters, and I have been like making the rounds around the question of what should we do about data centers. You're going to have two school of thoughts after this. One, this is the second time you have data centers being targeted in war. The first time was in the Ukraine theater, Ukrainians targeting Ukrainian data centers in Ukrainian occupied land, and Russians doing the same, and now with the Iranians striking, attacking data centers in the Gulf. The question will be, or the two scenarios are, one is, do you treat it as Intel in Israel platform, that you have to have its own multi-layered air defense system, or this is going to be very similar to hospitals, other strategic assets, and you will defend it as you defend other assets. I think that will depend on the country. That's a question that will be posed to countries, militaries. It will also depend on the kind of data center that we're talking about. If it's a 50 megawatt data center, will you add an air defense system to a 50 megawatt data center? I don't think so. But if it's a cluster, anything above half gigawatt, maybe that will be a different, will require a different security umbrella and a different air defense system.
Last round of pocket.
Thank you for your book, and congratulations on it. What got my attention was your discussion of the Quad, because I was Deputy Secretary of State at the end of George W. Bush's administration, and I was the guy on the 7th floor who was suppressing the idea of surfacing the notion of the Quad as a matter of policy. And my reason for doing that, I'm involved in a bit of introspection here, but was that I think I was trying to protect the more traditional view we had of our relationship with China. And I knew that this would get the Chinese upset. And I knew that the people who were advocating it, that's what they wanted to do. They weren't talking grand strategy. They wanted to piss off the Chinese. Seriously. And that was going to be one of the mechanisms for doing it. So, I mean, I have lots of questions, but just sticking to this one, how do you think they're going to read your book in Beijing?
Maybe I'm not gonna be I'm gonna be persona non grata, I guess. I mean, few things. One is I am not gonna be a war hawk and say the end game is a great war over certain territory. That's not really where I come from. I think war comes with a cost, and I'm very, very cognizant of this because I have seen what war would do. This being said, the optimal reality or the optimal result would be a detente around certain red lines that we have, that they have at the end of the day. And it seems to me that the current administration is thinking like in a G2 terminology. It also seems to me that the previous team also around some issues were comfortable with some sort of arrangement with China. So it seems that this is going to be the new norm, that we are trying to accommodate around some issues, not all the issues, but some issues. How they're going to be reading it, I mean, listen, I'm not the first one who's trying to think about the question of China and Asia. There are a lot of great books out there who are trying to theorizing about how can we, at the end of the day,
widening the boundaries.
exactly. And hopefully we're going to reach Kiev.
The other, I forgot to mention, I share your great admiration, I think you expressed it that way, of Mr. Abe.
Mm-hmm.
And I was Director of National Intelligence when I first met him. And I think at that time he was a national security advisor to Prime Minister Koizumi. And he was one really impressive guy. And I don't think he's typical of Japanese thinking at all. And yet I think he's managed to, he managed to convert his country, really. For that, I respect him a great deal, respect his memory.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Appreciate that. Okay, go back there.
My name is Mia Venezia. I'm a graduate student at Johns Hopkins SAIS and a former associate at the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. You mentioned at length the role of India and Japan in shaping your analysis, particularly in construction of the West Asia concept. But you briefly mentioned in the book, particularly in the chapter on the Indo-Islamic axis, the role of Southeast Asia in shaping your construction of West Asia. Could you elaborate a bit more on that, please?
Yeah, I think there's a theme across the book, which is Asia minus China framework. I'm arguing and making the case that China is extremely important to the rise of Asia. That's absolutely true, based on all the numerical terms you will find from trade, demographics, what have you, whatever factors. This being said, there's a larger story, which is the rise of Asia collectively, and I'm talking specifically about Indonesia, the country that I think completely under discussed, and I don't think even in my book I did give the country the credit it deserve. But in the book I'm talking about the GCC as a nerve center, but that's making this Eurasian rimland a reality. And I'm using two frameworks. One is the GCC EU summit. I'm also using the GCC ASEAN summit, which I think also is very under discussed reality. Even during Gaza, you had a very insistency on the Gulf part that this summit will continue. Part of it is they are seeing ASEAN, they understand the demography, the geography, and on top of that, it's also part of this Asianization of the Middle East. That yes, there is engagement with India, but also there is Pakistan deal. There's also ASEAN summit. There is engagement with Korea and Japan, and ASEAN is core to that. Part of it is culturally, but part of it is the actual economic weight that Indonesia is playing, and also the transformation, the industrial transformation of Indonesia, and how this is impacting the relationship with Qatar, with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE.
Down here.
Hi, Tom.
Hold on just a second, get the microphone.
Hi, from the second row. So I lived in the Gulf for several years and other places in East Asia, so certainly interested by the concept overall. I guess what I haven't heard a lot of is talking more about the other countries of West Asia beyond the GCC and sort of what happens in the Iraqs, the Syrias, independent perhaps even of the GCC in this construct.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. I think I submitted this manuscript around December 2024, January 2025. And at that time, it was the beginning of Syria, I think. And I left Syria as an open question. And also I have a whole chapter on Egypt. So let's start with the Levant. I think it will all depends on the success or failure of Syria as a project. Because I think the success of Syria will be important because there will be a spillover effect. That means Lebanon, that means Iraq, that also means for the first time you have an economic bridge between Turkey and the Gulf that has a lot of strategic meanings, has a lot of economic and meanings as well. So that's on the question of the Levant. I think I was at that time, I'll be frank, maybe the very idea that Bashar al-Assad is in Damascus was absolutely suppressing any idea of integration of the Levant in a broader geoeconomic system. With Ahmad al-Shara and the Saudi big bet on Syria, on Ahmad al-Shara, I think that this is something to be aware of. I think I'm positive. I think if they did it, I think that will be one of the greatest positive stories in the region in the next 20 years. On the question of Egypt, which is a country everyone keep asking me about it, I think is going through a very interesting transformation geographically and demographically that's I think under discussed. This is a country of 120 million people and has always been an interior state, has always been around Cairo, around the Nile, nothing really more. They were never really like a sea nation with the traditional sense. Now there's a huge push towards, they're pushing the demographics into the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. And I don't think I don't understand even what does it mean. But the very idea that 120 million people are going to be pushed to all these cities that are being built in the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the Red Sea, I think that's going to have a geopolitical implications. And right now, it started to have a military aspects. The very idea, they decided 6 years ago to develop 2 sea navy and actually bring helicopter carriers from the French. And now they're willing to deploy forces in Somalia. I think that this is the beginning of a different trend for Egypt, that they're starting to play a security role much more on the African side, rather than the actual the West Asian side.
Back there.
Hello, Vince Carchidi here. So bringing it back to AI a little bit. You had said AI is infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
Very familiar with your view on this, obviously. But so if AI is not models, I'm very sympathetic to this, because I get what you're saying where, okay, if you need to deploy this in the ways that it's going to be deployed, you need the infrastructure, you need the scale. So it's kind of a moot point whether, about the models, you need the infrastructure. That's the point that you're making. The compute really is everything. But let me play devil's advocate a little bit here. What are we saying? Are we saying the private sector has the models covered? Basically what exists is what's going to be useful for the United States, for West Asia. Are we just assuming that once we can deploy them, once we have the infrastructure, it's kind of all good to go and we can assume that the private sector pretty much has it? Or does there need to be some kind of other either state-backed research and development or standards of some kind that really need to be tacked on to the infrastructure? Or are you saying, look, one step at a time, infrastructure is really all we need right now?
I think my position has always been on the second part. Infrastructure is all what you need now. I don't think I'm worried about LLMs. I think LLMs having right now a very interesting trajectory in terms of self-development, in terms of deployment, in terms of the way they're improving. I mean, you are seeing this every quarter, not every year anymore. Yeah. So I think I'm much more on there is compute deficit, go build the infrastructure. The very idea about which LLMs, which enterprise layer, I'm not really concerned with that. And it's specifically in the case of the Gulf, because there's a huge deficit and someone needs to build that. There's a huge demand, someone needs to build that. Who exactly is going to using that? I don't think that this is worrisome for me. And this is, for example, in the case of Saudi Arabia, they had commitments and then to build gigawatts of capacity, and then later on, way after the MOU, You had Elon Musk and xAI saying, well, we're interested in a capacity, can we lease that in you? So you build the infrastructure and they will come afterwards because everyone has needs and someone needs to service those needs.
Thank you.
Well, the weather has lifted. Hopefully you are all feeling refreshed, and we've all given you some new things to think about and new ways to think about them. And please join me in congratulating Mohammed Soliman on the publication of West Asia. Well done, Mohammed. Thank you all very much.